Good evening. Hello again. Welcome. My name is Jerry Dietrich. I am the Public Participation Specialist for the Department of Toxic Substances Control. On behalf of the department, we thank you for joining us for this webinar on the lead-acid battery recycling facility investigation and cleanup program, also called the LABRIC program.
Hola.
This webinar includes an introduction to what we call the Area Screening and Prioritization document. I'll be defining this document in just a few minutes, but first, I'd like to add that this is the LABRIC team's first Zoom webinar, and we want to thank you ahead of time for your patience while we navigate this new territory for all of us. If you experience technical difficulties during the webinar, we ask that you log out and log back in using the confirmation email information, either a link or the call-in number that was provided to you. Again, if you're just joining, if you want to listen in Spanish, you can look for the icon at the bottom of your screen that says interpretation. Next slide, please. As glad as we are that we're all here, we do understand that some people will not be able to join us right now. For that reason, we're going to be recording this webinar so we can post it to the LABRIC webpage later. That way people can view it later. During the meeting, your audio will be muted to avoid any background noise on the recording. Later on, during the Q&A, you'll be able to unmute yourself when you're asking a question. Although we may not be able to get to everyone's comments or questions on this webinar, you can always contact us afterwards and we'll respond to you directly. Thank you again for your patience and understanding. Next slide. Our meeting goals for this webinar are to provide you with a background of DTSC's LABRIC program, what the program has been doing since the last time we met with the public in 2018, and what you can expect from the program in the future. After that, we'll be introducing the document I referenced earlier. It's called The Screening Criteria for Areas Potentially Qualifying for Use of Fund Monies and Scoring Methodology for Prioritizing Investigations or Evaluations of Qualifying Areas. I know, it's a long name. So to make things easier for all of us, we're going to refer to it as the Area Screening Criteria and Prioritization document. After the presentation, the rest of the webinar will be focused on questions from the public, followed by information on how to contact the LABRIC program team for any follow-up questions. The DTSC LABRIC team is committed to having meaningful engagement where your voices can be heard by decision makers and where honest dialogue can take place about how we can best provide you with the information going forward about the program and how often you like to receive that information. We welcome your feedback on this webinar and any suggestions you have for future communications. We want to do our best to share information and welcome questions from community members with the short time we have available. If you're a member of the media, we are asking that you direct your questions to Barbara Zumwalt, DTSC Public Information Officer, at barbara.zumwalt@dtsc.ca.gov. At this time, I'd like to hand it over to our first presenter, Steve Sterling, Acting LABRIC Program Supervisor, and I'll hand it over to him at this time. Next slide.
Thank you, Jerry. Hello, everyone. And again, welcome to DTSC's LABRIC program's first public webinar. My name is Steve Sterling, and I would like to begin this presentation with a quote from Robert D. Bullard, a renowned author and distinguished professor at Texas Southern University, who many consider to be the father of environmental justice. Professor Bullard wrote, "Environmental justice embraces the principle that all people and communities are entitled to equal protection of environmental and public health laws and regulations." DTSC is inspired by Professor Bullard's words, and we are committed to the principles of environmental justice. During this presentation, we will show you how DTSC's LABRIC program uses the scoring process to prioritize areas which qualify for investigation or evaluation, and how we include the use of the Cal EnviroScreen database. This database identifies California communities which are disproportionately burdened by and vulnerable to multiple sources of pollution. Incorporating information from the Cal EnviroScreen database helps us to evaluate, among other factors, economic disadvantage and racial inequity, with an emphasis on communities reasonably suspected to have been contaminated by the operation of lead-acid battery recycling facilities. This is described in detail in the area screening criteria and prioritization document and is briefly discussed in this presentation. Next slide, please. Moving to slide 5, we are at the presentation topics for today. We will begin the presentation by first visiting DTSC's overall mission and reviewing the LABRIC program's background. We will then provide a look at the most recent program activities. This will be followed by a brief discussion of the purpose of what we call the area screening criteria and prioritization document, along with a brief description of the California legislation which supports the creation and implementation of this document. We will then present the criteria used to screen areas to determine if they qualify to use money from the Lead Acid Battery Cleanup Fund for investigation or evaluation, and will end with a discussion of our process for prioritizing those areas which do qualify for further investigation. Next slide, please. Now on slide 6, we have DTSC's mission. It reads, the mission of DTSC is to protect California's people and the environment from harmful effects of toxic substances by restoring contaminated resources, enforcing hazardous waste laws, reducing hazardous waste generation, and encouraging the manufacture of chemically safer products. DTSC's mission includes protecting people in areas who are potentially exposed to contamination caused by the operation of lead-acid battery recycling facilities. It also includes the effective use of the Lead-Acid Battery Cleanup Fund, which is intended to be used for the investigation and cleanup of areas of the state contaminated by the operations of lead-acid battery recycling facilities. I will now hand it over to Mario Cazares, LABRIC program team member, to provide the background and latest updates on the LABRIC program. Mario, next slide, please.
Thank you, Steve. Hi, everyone. My name is Mario Cazares, and we would like to give you some background information on DTSC's LABRIC program and the California legislation which authorized and directed the creation of the program. We will then summarize the LABRIC program's most recent actions. The LABRIC program was created by the Lead-Acid Battery Recycling Act of 2016, which we will call the Act from now on. The Act provides the legal framework for our mission to identify and clean up areas contaminated by lead-acid battery recyclers. DTSC wants to extend its deepest gratitude to Assembly Member Cristina Garcia for championing the cause of removing lead from impacted soils. She introduced the legislation in 2016 that enabled DTSC to create the LABRIC program and implement it as part of California's Health and Safety Code. Allow me to share with you the intention of this 2016 Act and what it entails. The legislation calls for fees of $1 per battery imposed on manufacturers of lead-acid batteries for each battery they sell at retail to a person, or to a dealer, wholesaler, or distributor. It should be noted that the largest number of these batteries are automobile batteries. These fees are placed into the Lead-Acid Battery Cleanup Fund, or the fund for short. These fees will then increase to $2 per battery in April of 2022. The LABRIC program is authorized to use monies from the fund to perform a limited number of specific activities. These activities involve two major components. One, the investigation or evaluation of areas reasonably suspected to have been contaminated by the operation of a lead-acid battery recycling facility. And two, the cleanup of areas contaminated from a lead-acid battery recycling facility, as well as other response actions. In order for an area to meet the requirements for using monies from the Lead-Acid Battery Cleanup Fund for investigation or evaluation, two primary threshold questions must first be evaluated. 1. Is the facility a lead-acid battery recycling facility within the definition provided in the 2016 Act and subsequent legislation? And 2. Is there an area of the state that is reasonably suspected to have been contaminated by the operation of that facility? This means that in order to investigate an area using the lead-acid battery fund monies, the LABRIC program must first establish that a facility is or was a lead-acid battery recycling facility, and second, that there is an area we reasonably suspect to have been contaminated by the operation of that lead-acid battery recycling facility. Significant changes to DTSC's LABRIC program occurred when Assembly Bill 142 modified the 2016 Act in October of 2019. Assembly Bill 142 modified the Act in several ways, including the legal definition of a lead-acid battery recycling facility and instituting new standards that the LABRIC program was required to follow to use the lead-acid battery fund monies, among other requirements. As a result, we were required to modify our process and procedures. Most recently, Assembly Bill 2104 was signed into law in September of 2020. This bill again modified the LABRIC program requirements, but all program adjustments have been made to meet these recent changes. The provisions of Assembly Bill 2104 will become effective January 1st of 2021. The DTSC LABRIC program also submits a report to the legislator to provide information on its activities and accomplishments, as well as anticipated future actions. When the 2020 legislative report is released, we will host another webinar to present it to the public and post the report to the DTSC LABRIC webpage. Some of the direct actions taken by the LABRIC program to implement the 2016 Act and all subsequent legislative changes include monitoring battery dealer and manufacturer compliance with certain requirements of the original 2016 Act. In September of 2019, the LABRIC program provided a courtesy reminder to more than 6,000 battery dealers and manufacturers registered with the California Department of Tax and Fee Administration. The LABRIC program has developed and will use a detailed inspection checklist to ensure consistency of all inspections. The inspections will begin when the COVID-19 pandemic has subsided. We have also completed and continue to work on researching and identifying potential lead-acid battery recycling facilities. In addition, we developed a process to screen these facilities and surrounding areas to see if they are eligible for investigation and cleanup according to legislation. After screening out dozens of suspected areas, we have compiled a list of potentially eligible areas which need to be prioritized for further investigation. This brings us to the purpose of sharing the area screening criteria and prioritization document through this webinar today. At this time, I'll hand it back to Steve Sterling. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Mario, for that background information and legislative update. Now on slide 8, I would like to share the purpose of the area screening criteria and prioritization document. First, this document outlines the criteria that we use to screen each potential contaminated area to determine if it is eligible to use monies from the lead acid battery cleanup fund for investigation or evaluation. Second, the area screening criteria and prioritization document describes the scoring process we use to prioritize areas qualifying for investigation or further evaluation, which includes areas reasonably suspected to have been contaminated by the operation of a lead acid battery recycling facility. It should be noted that neither the screening criteria nor prioritization process discussed in this presentation and in the area screening criteria and prioritization document apply to the former Exide Technologies lead acid battery recycling facility project area. At this time, I would like to let everyone know that the area screening criteria and prioritization document is a living document. DTSC will update the criteria used in this document as it gains more experience and information on lead acid battery recycling facilities in California and on surrounding communities. The document is available on the LABRIC screening webpage at www.dtsc.gov/LABRIC_site-screening. For your reference, this link is shown at the bottom of this presentation slide, and again on the summary slide at the end of this presentation. Next slide, please. Now on slide 9, we will discuss the first step in our efforts to screen potentially contaminated areas. The criteria used to screen areas include 2 primary threshold questions that first must be answered. These 2 questions ask, A, whether a facility is or used to be a lead-acid battery recycling facility, and B, is an area reasonably suspected of being contaminated by the operation of that facility. The answer to these questions allow us to determine if an area qualifies to use monies from the Lead-Acid Battery Cleanup Fund to conduct an investigation or site evaluation, and if that area will continue through LABRIC's scoring process to be prioritized for investigation or further evaluation. There are 4 possible outcomes resulting from the screening of areas by answering these 2 threshold questions. These possible outcomes, which LABRIC program uses to make area determinations, are shown on the next slide. Next slide, please. Now on slide 10, the 4 possible outcomes of an area screening are shown as responses to the 2 primary threshold questions. Is or was the facility a lead-acid battery recycling facility? And is there an area that is reasonably suspected to have contamination from that lead-acid battery recycling facility? In the first 2 sets of responses on this slide, shown as numbers 1 and 2, the answer to the second question about an area being suspected of having contamination is no. So the area is not eligible to use monies from the Lead-Acid Battery Cleanup Fund because no contamination has been found. As a result, such areas will not continue through the remainder of the scoring process. In the third response, shown as number 3, there is no information indicating that the facility in the area being screened is or ever was a lead-acid battery recycling facility, but there is an area reasonably suspected of having contamination. In this scenario, the area being screened is not eligible to use monies from the Lead-Acid Battery Cleanup Fund because the facility in that area was not be a lead-acid battery recycling facility as per the definition in Assembly Bill 2104. Therefore, the area will not continue through the remainder of the scoring process, but will be referred to DTSC's cleanup program. In the fourth and final response, the answers to both questions are yes. Yes, the facility being screened has been determined to be a lead-acid battery recycling facility. And yes, there's an area that is reasonably suspected to have been contaminated from that facility. Next slide, please. Here on slide 11 is a detailed description of the fourth response to the threshold questions shown on the previous slide. We like to call this response the yes-yes outcome of an area screening. Likewise, in the area screening criteria and prioritization document, this outcome is indicated as a yes-yes scenario. In this yes-yes area screening outcome, the facility and areas affected by contamination from that facility are eligible to use money from the Lead-Acid Battery Cleanup Fund for investigation or further evaluation, and will continue through the remainder of the scoring process to receive a score that prioritizes that area at and around that facility for investigation or site evaluation. On the next slide, we'll share the scoring process used by the LABRIC program to prioritize areas which qualify for investigation or evaluation using money from the Lead-Acid Battery Cleanup Fund. Next slide, please. Now on slide 12, showing are the 4 categories of factors used to score and prioritize areas in the screening process we have developed. The first category is assessment of potential risks to human health. This category focuses on the number of people and sensitive populations living within a quarter mile of a lead acid battery recycling facility. The second category, shown as category 5.2 on this slide, is the assessment of populations living within 1/4 mile of a lead acid battery recycling facility that are vulnerable, low-income populations disproportionately burdened by multiple sources of pollution. The third category, shown as 5.3 on this slide, encompasses additional prioritization factors, which include the consideration of recommendations from other government agencies and the professional judgment of DTSC's LABRIC program staff. In the fourth and final category, shown as category 5.4, we consider the overall numeric score assigned to an area at and around the lead acid battery recycling facility being scored. What I would like to do now is walk you through a description of the various factors included in these 4 categories one by one. We will begin with the first category, assessment of potential risks to human health. Next slide, please. Before we get started on describing the factors in these categories, I would like to remind everyone that for your review, area screening criteria and prioritization document is available on the LABRIC site screening webpage. On slide 13, we show the first category, assessment of potential risks to human health, which includes the following prioritization factors. First, we use an estimate of the number of people living in close proximity to a lead acid battery recycling facility who might be at risk of being exposed to contamination released from that facility. The greater the population, the higher the score. The second factor is the number of schools, parks, child care centers, outdoor youth sports complexes, and community garden areas within 1/4 mile of a lead acid battery recycling facility. These are locations where children congregate for extended periods of time. The more locations in proximity to a lead acid battery recycling facility, the higher the score. The third factor is the documented highest lead contamination levels at the lead acid battery recycling facility being scored. The higher the level of contamination, the higher the score. The fourth factor includes the number of lead acid battery recycling facilities and other lead emitters within 1/4 mile of the lead acid battery recycling facility being scored. This factor attempts to account for potential past releases of contamination. The more facilities and lead emitters in proximity to the lead acid battery recycling facility being scored, the higher the score for that factor. Next slide, please. Now on slide 14, we will describe the second category of prioritization factors considered in our scoring process. This category involves the assessment of existing vulnerability, environmental burden, and social and economic factors. The first factor in this category is the number of census tracts with higher Cal EnviroScreen scores located within 1/4 mile of the lead acid battery recycling facility being scored. Census tracts with high scores represent communities that are disproportionately burdened by and vulnerable to multiple sources of pollution. The greater the number of these census tracts, the higher the score. The second factor encompasses the average percentage of homes built before 1980 that are located within 1/4 mile of a lead acid battery recycling facility. This factor attempts to identify houses likely to contain lead-based paint and to address the threat of cumulative lead exposure on sensitive populations, including children. The greater percentage of houses built before 1980 in proximity to the lead acid battery recycling facility being scored, the higher the score for this factor. The third factor in this category is the percentage of families located within 1/4 mile of a lead acid battery recycling facility whose income in the past 12 months is below the statewide poverty level. This factor attempts to use census data to identify economically disadvantaged populations because insecurity and poverty can negatively affect health outcomes, especially with children and people in vulnerable and underserved communities. Next slide, please. Now on slide 15, shown are the factors in the third category, additional prioritization factors. The first factors consider federal, state, or local agency recommendations, requests, or identified need for additional investigation of an area that DTSC has determined to be reliable and appropriate information. Secondly, other information that, in DTSC's professional judgment, is relevant to prioritizing an area for investigation or evaluation. This information may include public interest, length of history of operations at a facility, collaboration with other agencies, facility exhaust stack height, and other information. Next slide, please. Now on slide 16, I will begin to present how DTSC's LABRIC program will calculate an area's overall numeric score. As previously discussed, every potential lead acid battery recycling facility is first evaluated against the two primary threshold questions, which again are, 1, is or has a facility been a lead acid battery recycling facility? And 2, is there an area reasonably suspected to have been contaminated by the operation of that facility? Once again, after answering these two questions, each area for which the answers to both of these questions are yes will qualify for use of lead acid battery cleanup fund monies and will be scored and prioritized for investigation or further evaluation. For each of these qualifying areas, an overall total score will be calculated using the following process. Next slide, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ravi Gill. I'm an engineer at the LABRIC program. So now on slide 17, for each qualifying area, an overall numeric score will be calculated by adding together all prioritization factor scores from each category of factors. Using the equation shown on the next slide, the areas with the highest overall scores will be ranked highest and prioritized for investigation or evaluation by the LABRIC program. Next slide, please. Now, slide 18, this slide shows how an overall final area score is calculated. First, the factors previously described in sections 5.1, 5.2, and 5.3 of this presentation are summed together to determine the subtotal score in each category. This is followed by the addition of all category subtotal scores to calculate the overall final area score. An example score calculation for an area is shown on the next slide. Next slide, please. Here on slide 19 is an example of a score calculation for an area. As can be seen, each prioritization factor is scored, followed by the calculation of each section's subtotal score, which in turn is followed by the addition of all subtotal scores to calculate the overall final area score. All scored areas will be ranked using the overall final area score, with the highest scored area considered first for investigation or further evaluation. Next slide, please. We are now on slide 20. In summary, we have presented the criteria used by DTSC's LABRIC program for screening areas at and around potential lead acid battery recycling facilities to determine if they are eligible to use money from the Lead Acid Battery Cleanup Fund for investigation or further evaluation. This was followed by a description of the scoring process used to prioritize those areas qualifying to use lead-acid battery cleanup fund monies. This scoring process will allow DTSC to identify the areas to be first investigated or evaluated. This effort was made with attention on vulnerable, economically disadvantaged communities where people experience a greater burden from pollution, including exposure to lead contamination. The LABRIC program is helping to meet the mission of DTSC by working to identify and prevent dangerous exposure to lead contamination from lead-acid battery recycling facilities. Through this effort, we are helping to promote healthy California communities and community revitalization, all of this while working toward achieving racial equity. Once again, the link to the area screening criteria and prioritization document is located on the LABRIC site screening webpage. The link is provided at the bottom of this presentation slide. This concludes our presentation on the LABRIC program's area screening criteria and prioritization process. I will now pass it back to Jerry. Jerry, next slide, please.
Thank you, Ravi. At this time, that was a lot of information, but right now we're going to transition into the Q&A. But before we do, I'd like to make sure that everyone knows how to contact us to give us feedback on the document that we just heard about. And then also, for anyone who's just joining right now, if you need to listen in Spanish, you can click the interpretation icon at the bottom of the screen. So in order to provide feedback for this document, you could email us at labrf@dtsc.ca.gov, or you can reach us by phone at 833-752-2742. The message line will record your message, and then I will call you back within 48 hours. You can also send written feedback to me at my email, at my email or by mail, in the mail to Jerry Dietrich, Public Participation Specialist, 8800 Cal Center Drive in Sacramento, 95826. And I think we need to be on slide 21 for this information.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, so here's all the information. We're going to move to the Q&A, which is slide 22. Thank you, Tammy. Tammy's our wonderful slide share person. Thank you so much. So in order for the Q&A, for us to do the Q&A, what we're going to do is we're going to offer 3 different ways for people to ask a question. You can use the raise your hand feature at the bottom of your screen, and when we unmute you, you can ask your question. If you're joining us by phone, which I don't see anyone joining by phone, but if you are and I just can't tell, you'll need to press *9 in order to raise your hand, and then when we call on you, you'll press *6 to unmute your phone. Alternately, you can use the Q&A box to type in your question, and then I will read it out loud. Each community member will have 2 minutes to ask their question. And we ask that you remain muted when you're not speaking. We'll take the first hand up I see is Miss Jane Williams. I'm going to, please bear with me. Okay, Miss Williams, you have 2 minutes. Please go ahead and unmute yourself and state your question.
Okay, well, thank you for this presentation today. Are you guys taking public comment on this?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a living document, and we're going to receive comments from the community and evaluate our process to work for improvement and to get the best possible screening process we can and the scoring process.
Because we actually have a really good idea because of all the hard work from Mr. Eccles and his team where these facilities are. Mm-hmm. And many of your screening criteria don't reflect that. For instance, the 0.25, the quarter mile. Mm-hmm. Most of the lead smelters in California that were cited none of them were cited that closely together.
Well, Yeah.
Okay, just let me go through the list really
Yes.
fast because you're only giving me 2 minutes. Okay.
Very good.
And the 1980 homes, like that's not going to fly. You can't screen people out because they live in an old house. I mean, you'd screen out all of East LA and South Central, where we know that there's a huge plethora of concentrated lead smelters. So like that, I don't know who came up with that criteria, but that's a no-go for me. The other thing that you fail to apprehend here is that the longer a smelter operated, the bigger the mess it's made. And I don't see any provision in any of this scoring to say, wow, like if I had a smelter and it operated 100 years, like that thing really, we got to go out and investigate that neighborhood because they could have just really made a giant mess. And that's one of the problems with X-type. It's one of the oldest continually operated lead smelters actually in the world, not just in the United States, but in the world. So that's just my quick, I don't know if I'm hit my 2 minutes, but I applaud.
You did, but that's okay. If you could ask your question at this time.
I applaud the effort. Like I applaud the effort to try to like put all this into an equation. But I think that we will definitely be commenting and saying, I don't know, you guys, you kind of have to rethink some of these metrics that you're using, especially the 1980 home one. That shouldn't have any bearing on whether you have 1,000 ppm of lead in your yard or not, right? So that's the question that I had was the one you answered, which was, are you taking public comments? And can you also tell me when that comment period ends?
It doesn't.
Oh. It doesn't. We'll be accepting comments ongoing. It's a living document, so we want to get feedback as we learn and as we turn the corners to this project. Absolutely.
Okay, great. That's awesome to hear. Thank you so much for letting me speak.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I'd like to address a couple of Jane's questions.
Sure.
Yeah, so the issue that you brought up about a quarter mile away from the lead acid battery recycling facility, what we're doing is trying to score facilities relative to one another. So we need to use consistent criteria. And so we thought that the quarter mile distance would be appropriate for a comparison because obviously the most impacted area would be closest to the facility. So that's just one of the criteria to rank them relative to one another. It gives us one aspect of scoring each and every site. The 1980 issue for the lead-based paint is, again, for cumulative potential effects in areas. So areas that are impacted by lead acid battery facility contamination, if it does exist, is also perhaps exposed to issues from lead-based paint. So that rolls into an overall ranking so that areas that do have high and have lead-based paint issues would perhaps be ranked higher than an area that isn't affected by homes built before 1980. So we're trying to address the most impacted communities first. That's why that's part of the criteria that we use. The longer operational history that you mentioned, Jane, is part of our DTSC program staff professional judgment. If that's one of the issues, we can rank that particular criteria high because it does have a very lengthy operational history. Okay.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, thank you.
So we don't have any questions in the Q&A box, and I don't see anyone joining the meeting by phone. I'm going to ask the interpreter if we have any questions on the Spanish side of the audio. And I'll ask one of our other panelists if they could let me know. Due to Zoom's limitations, I cannot hear the interpreter. Apologies. So we have no questions from the Spanish side. I will move back. There's no one raising their hand to ask a question. We do want to keep letting you know that at this time, you know, we are accepting comments on the document. We are ready and willing to provide any communication to you that you need. So connect with us, let us know, and we can touch bases. So seeing some questions in the Q&A now. David McGrath would like to know, when is the LABRIC annual report going to be released?
That's being reviewed at high levels within our department. And so I believe that that once they approve what we have put together as a summary for the legislature, that will go forward. It could be at any time, but as soon as it is released and approved, we will make it available to the public.
Thanks, Steve. Patricia Ochoa would like to know, how often can we expect the document to be updated?
As we've had quite a bit of discussion with this within the LABRIC program, and it's basically when we get a significant number or very substantial comments that we will address updating the site screening criteria and prioritization document. So we will have to wait and see what kind of comments come in, but we want to keep it up to date as much as possible to keep it current with issues identified by the community. And what we find as we go through the process and learn more about lead acid battery recycling facilities and community concerns.
Great, thank you. We see no hands raised. We have no questions in the Q&A. I don't think we have any questions on the Spanish audio side. Can we move to the next slide, maybe, Tammy? So again, if you want to provide feedback on the document, you can email us, you can call us on the phone, you can send me a letter in the mail here at this address at Cal Center Drive in Sacramento. We don't have any questions. No questions from the Spanish side, and no hands raised. So I'm going to take that as a good sign that we've done a really good job in giving you a lot of good information. And the website will be updated with a copy of a recording of this webinar for future viewing. Right now, the prioritization document is on the website at the site screening webpage for the LABRIC DTSC webpage. As soon as we have more events that we can schedule out for the public, we'll be using the e-list to provide that information about how to register for more webinars or public meetings. So if you haven't joined the e-list, you can go ahead. Can we go to the next slide, please? The e-list, the other way, please.
Nope.
One more. Ready to go. There we go. Oh, wait. So it is on the DTSC website, dtsc.ca.gov/DTSC-e.lists. You'll have to scroll down a little bit and find the LABRIC e-list subscription page, and then go ahead and put your information in there. And then when the webinar recording is ready to be posted, we'll send out an e-blast. And when we make changes to the document, we'll send out an e-blast. When we have the legislative report ready for publication, we'll send out an e-blast. So please be a part of our circle. We have one more question, Ms. Jane Williams. How many sites do you think will be eligible?
We don't have an answer for that yet. We've currently screened 35 sites. The majority of those have fallen out because it hasn't answered yes or yes to those two threshold questions. So we haven't finished screening and currently any sites, but in the 2001, we're going to be able to score sites and move into the investigation phase on those sites to start this whole process. So we're just not sure how many will eventually be eligible, but it's an ongoing effort through our site discovery process, and then the site screening and into the scoring, and then into the investigation phase of our work.
Thanks, Steve. So again, to provide feedback, go ahead and give us an email on the document. If you have some feedback about our webinar, about things we can do differently, other ways you'd like to receive information, please let us know. Seeing no questions in the Q&A, no hands raised. I think we're done. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Look for that. Oh, sorry, I spoke too soon. We have another comment. Many of the Eccles List sites were sent to the DTSC almost a decade ago. When are we going to get these sites, and what is the timeline?
These have been part of our consideration for the different sites to be lead-acid battery recycling facilities. We've gone through and identified those that have the information necessary to qualify and be pulled in for consideration with LABRIC. So now we're working through researching those sites to definitively answer the question of, is it actually a lead-acid battery recycling facility? And is there an area reasonably suspected of having contamination from that facility? So the Eccles List has been considered, and not all of those have qualified to move into the next phase of research. So it's part of the mix that we are looking at for the program.
Thank you. And thank you, Jane, for asking that question. We do have a lot of time left. If you have any questions that you want to ask, oh, here we go. Another one, yay. So I'm going to go ahead and ask Ms. Williams to unmute herself. Let me find her on the list real quick, because I think she has a lot of follow-up questions, and we have a lot of time. So I think that we can do this.
Sure.
Go ahead and unmute yourself, Jane.
I did.
Okay.
So if you're looking at the Eccles sites lists and you're looking for sites that already have like phase 2 data, then most of your sites would get screened out because very few of them have that kind of data.
Well, we have to adhere what the legislation mandates. And so we've very objectively looked at all of those sites listed in the Eccles list. And indeed, some of them, if not the majority, have fallen out. But the ones that we can work on, we have moved into the next phase, and we're considering those.
Well, what do you mean they've fallen out? Because you don't have data on them?
Right. That's correct. So Jane, it's an ongoing effort. We haven't looked at every single possible site, but we're going list and we're doing what we can to identify the information necessary to pull those into the program. If the information and evidence isn't there, then we just can't address them. They won't be eligible to use the cleanup fund monies.
So you're saying that when US EPA sent you the sites into your RCRA corrective action 10 years ago, they did not transmit to you enough data to make them eligible?
Well, it depends on the site. We have to go site by site to see what information is available. So there's only so many staff in the program and only so many hours in the day, but we are going through every possible lead that we can to identify the sites. And then we will score them and rank them accordingly.
Thanks.
Okay,
Steve.
so
sorry,
but wait, I'm very confused because you guys were sent, pretty extensive information 10 years ago on many of these, on not all of these sites, but on some of these sites, and then you have the follow-up phase 1/2s that were done. So. I mean, how much longer are we going to wait? I mean, we've been waiting for 10 years.
Well, we haven't been around for 10 years, the LABRIC program. Jane, we had to build the foundation for the program. We had to design our process from beginning to end, from site discovery to screening to scoring to eventual and ultimately cleanup of every site that we have pulled into our program. We've had to adjust our process and procedures to deal with, maybe that's not the right term, but deal with the enhanced protection that is part of AB 142 and AB 2104. So as the program really got underway, we've had to redesign many of our process to account for the new legislation. We've had to and done an inspection protocol for the different manufacturer and dealers within the state of California. We've had building blocks in place, which we've done. And now we're getting to a point where we're getting ready to finish screening and scoring sites and get into the field to start doing investigative work.
Thanks, Steve. At this time, we're going to move on to the next question. Thank you so much, Dane, for your questions and your follow-up discussion. We really want to talk to you more. If you could send us an email, and I can set up a time for us to talk with the program, we'll be more than happy to do that. We're going to move to the next question asker, who's also the next hand raiser, Ms. Ashley Labar. I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself and go ahead and state your question.
Hi, my name is Ashley Labar, and I'm Assembly Member Christina Garcia's Chief of Staff and the staffer that worked on 2153, 142, and 2104. So thank you guys for this meeting. It's a long time coming, and we're glad to see the Labyrinth program moving forward and those funds being spent to clean up not only Exide, but other areas of the state that were contaminated by lead acid battery recycling facilities. I would appreciate it if the program staff could elaborate a little bit on the question that Jane asked about why would sites be taken out of potential sites from the Labyrinth program just because there's not enough information. I feel like the provisions in all of the bills, but particularly 2153, allow for the department to spend money on the investigation of sites to determine whether or not Labyrinth funds can be used on the facility cleanup if necessary.
Well, the two criteria, thanks Ashley for the question. The Assembly bills have certain requirements to be eligible to use the fund monies. And one of them is there is an area of the state that is reasonably suspected of having contamination from that facility. So as we stated in our presentation, and it's in the document as well, if we identify an area that has contamination, but there's no evidence that any facility nearby has been a lead acid battery recycling facility, it will be referred to DTSC's cleanup program. But we can't spend the LABRIC cleanup fund monies on that site unless it's clearly identified as a lead acid battery recycling facility.
That's correct. So you're saying that the sites that Jane's speaking about that are on the Eccles list are not meeting the criteria to have been reasonably suspected to have prior been a lead acid battery recycling facility that the bill requires. And that's why they're being removed.
Yes, for those on the list that we've looked at.
And that's those 35 locations that you've talked about.
So far, the Eccles list has over 400 sites. I don't know how many are in California. We've considered all of those that are in California as part of our overall investigation, that's not the right word, initial review of those sites to see if they're worth considering.
Okay, great. And then I know, and we've been asking for a couple years now, but I would be remiss if I didn't put in the plug that the Assembly member in our office and all the stakeholders involved in the process are really looking forward to receiving the Labyrinth annual reports that are due to the legislature, because we have not received the 2018 or 19 report that we're due in February. The 19 and 20 report that we're due in February, and it's almost time for the 2021 report to come out in February. And I know that all of the stakeholders, especially the Assembly member, would really like to see exactly what the Labyrinth funds have been spent on within the department. And I know that that would be coming out in the report. So I just, again, want to make a plug that's important to get that data out to all of the stakeholders who have been involved in this process.
Absolutely, and you're absolutely right. We are ready to release to put it out to the public as soon as it's released. I highly encourage you to suggest to your constituents that they sign up for the LABRIC e-list so that they can get that notification right away. You can also have people email me if they want to get added to the list and they can't, navigate their way there. I'll be more than happy to help people get on the list so that they can be notified as soon as that happens.
Great. Thank you guys so much for your time, and thank you for putting it on.
Thank you.
You, Ashley.
So thank you, everyone. Again, this is a really good time for us. We want to use the time that we have to answer any questions you have. Thank you so much for the questions you've asked so far. We don't have any more in the Q&A. We don't have any more hands raised. The slide that's up right now has my email. It has the LABRIC email that you can provide your comments on the document to. Please join the e-list, share the e-list sign up link with everyone that you know that would like to get information about the LABRIC team's progress and our future events. But at this time, seeing no more questions, no more hands raised, I'm going to ask one more time to see if any of the panelists can tell me if we have any questions on the Spanish audio. Doesn't look like we have any, so we're going to go ahead and end the webinar. Thank you again so much. We really enjoy having this dialogue with you, and we look forward to having more. Please send us your comments, send us your feedback, and we'll let you know when we're going to do this again. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.